Hi there, and welcome back to our study group going through Peter Adamson's History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps podcast. Today with me, Rogerio Marquez and Graham Pong. Hi guys, welcome.
Hey,
Great to be back.
we're finally wrapping up Plato.
Yeah, been talking about Plato for a while. Today we'll do the last 4 episodes about Plato, and we'll go through the dialogues, the Timaeus, the Symposium, Phaedrus, and the Lysis. Some of the dialogues are mentioned also, but I think those are the center of attention. And we'll also be talking a little bit about Plato's comments, attitude towards, and use of myth. And yeah.
Okay, so let's fire up the visual aids and travel through Plato's accounts on love, the universe, and everything mythical. And so one thing that was striking in Peter Adamson's episode on the Timaeus was when he mentioned the historical context in which the Platonic dialogues started to become available to Europe during the medieval period. It turns out the Timaeus was actually one of the first dialogues that became available and translated into Latin. The language in which medieval monks would study, and the other Platonic dialogues, like the major one, the Republic, only became available much later during the 15th century. And although we must be kind of conservative in assigning causal effects on the Platonic dialogues in relation to the end of the medieval period and the beginning of the Renaissance, there is some correlation with the Platonic dialogues becoming available in Europe and the Renaissance happening even in phases in different parts, like in Italy, it started first. And also there is a correlation if we turn our attention to the Arab world. The Arab world translated from Greek to Arabic earlier, and I'm not knowledgeable on the dates, but for sure they had the more Platonic works earlier and more ancient Greek literature in general, which was also correlated with what we call the Arab Golden Age, which was an expression of an elevation of and flourishing of philosophy, science, theology, cosmology, astronomy, etc., which only happened in Europe like 4 centuries with a 4-century delay in relation to the Arab world. And well, this is my reading. Feel free, guys, to comment as well.
Yeah, it's an interesting correlation or interesting coincidence in time. It's a hypothesis that's slightly at odds with some other people's hypothesis that science was sort of born out of a Christian reverence for the truth, and so like at least one other possible. It's speculative, but like hypothesis of like where science got it started from was this kind of more Platonic Socratic quest for knowledge as the highest virtue. So in the Socrates makes a big deal that all virtue, everything about being a good person boils down to having knowledge of the good and having knowledge generally. So research and knowledge being the highest priority in a person's life. At least that makes it, in my head, maybe even a bit more sense than like the Christian reverence for truth as spurring science. But both of those hypotheses is extremely speculative, and frankly, history is way more complicated than just boiling down to simple things like that. So,
Graham, you're back just in time to share a few words if you'd like.
Oh, absolutely. No, this is a fascinating. I'm always fascinated by the warp and weave of history. And in this one, I was going to say on the start of science, I usually point science as we know it kind of started with Archimedes, who we haven't covered yet. He was over in Syracuse in Sicily, and a lot of the Renaissance in the West was started by the wars in the East, with the fall of Constantinople in the 1400s a couple of times to the Crusaders the first time, and the Ottoman Empire did a lot to send scholars and works fleeing from the city getting sacked and going to the West. And it's just interesting to see how things become available at different points in time. Tagging out.
Yeah. Okay, so if you guys would like, we could move on to the Timaeus.
Sure.
Okay, so Timaeus. In a nutshell, Timaeus is Socrates, Hermocrates, and Critias listen to an account on the creation of the universe by Timaeus. And as Peter Adamson pointed out, this is maybe only initially in this work a dialogue, because Timaeus has like 16 lines in the entire thing. But after the midpoint, it's basically only Timaeus talking in a huge monologue that explains, he lays out a cosmology, basically. And so in typical Platonic fashion, Plato is using not Socrates this time, but Timaeus as a mouthpiece to what likely was Plato's construction of a cosmology, of explaining how the stuff of chairs and tables, like Michael Sugru likes to say, arose, and this work appeared later on in the Platonic works. It's one of the later dialogues, and maybe Plato wasn't so interested in natural philosophy, so he focused on many other topics more related to human nature and politics, initially in language and epistemology, and he only turned to this one, maybe because students, other people were asking for him to do something like this. Perhaps this is Michael Sugru's conjecture to explain why he took so long to work on a cosmology. But basically, and Peter Adamson alluded to this practice by Plato. Plato likes to, in the first words of his dialogues, to allude to major themes in his entire dialogue. So Socrates, the first thing that Socrates says is 1, 2, 3, and he's counting the guests to check that everyone is there. And this alludes to that there will be mathematics, geometry mentioned in this dialogue. Another dialogue that Peter Adamson mentioned in which this happens is in the Republic, when in the beginning Socrates says he descends or goes down to the Piraeus, which is the dock of Athens. And this is kind of like a foreshadowing of the allegory of the cave. And to try to put in a slide the cosmology, basically the cosmology by Plato is made up of different components, the demiurge, a being with the divine mind, and I underlined each of the components that alludes to a syncretism, which is Plato, for instance, the divine mind possibly came from Anaxagoras. Then the receptacle, a female, supposedly spherical container, which is nicely equivalent to the sphere that Parmenides mentions in his poem. And then the plans, the demiurge uses plans based on the forms. So this is from Plato himself, the use of the forms. The raw materials, the elements, that they kind of are not really fundamental elements. They behave as molecules, and there are the atoms per se, or elements, or triangles that make up these molecules, and the triangles themselves are indivisible, so they are, in this cosmology, the de facto atoms. And as we will see in the next slides, the triangles are come together to form the fundamental building blocks of Plato's cosmology. Then the demiurge himself, who was too busy building the universe itself, delegated, like a good leader, to these helper gods that are a reference to Hesiod and Homer, because Plato doesn't outright dismiss these gods. He includes them in his cosmology, even if he doesn't delve into their identities very precise, in high detail. So these create the humans from the elements, and this is all constrained by necessity, by limitations. So since the universe is being created in this receptacle that has the property of limited space, the things created in this universe will occupy space and might collide with each other. And with this, the demiurge produces a world of constant change. So an allusion or an ingredient from Heraclitean flux theory, and which is fundamentally mathematical, which Plato really liked geometry and mathematics a lot, and he possibly has influences from Pythagoras here. And so, yeah, this is the universe creation myth that Plato conjured up in the Timaeus, recounted by this titular character Timaeus. So yeah, what do you guys think about the Timaeus? Do you think it's do you think that Plato had reasons to make this up, or maybe he was trying to put together things that were popular at the time?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. I wanted to make a couple of comments just before answering that question. So, but the raw materials being the elements, I think he uses the elements earth, air, water, and fire that he got, I think, if I'm remembering correctly, from Empedocles.
Yeah, exactly. Peter Adamson mentions Empedocles, although in my research I found that since the polyhedra, or the elements cited by Plato, are 5, the 5th one is supposedly the aether.
Yeah, I think he associated one Platonic polyhedra or Platonic solid per element. Yeah, so that was the one comment about that, and then just a nice little example of the kind of necessities that the demiurge worked with. And Peterson does well to distinguish. He starts with the story of, imagine you were a medieval monk reading this, and so it's drawing distinctions between Plato's creator, the demiurge, and the more Christian creator, or the Abrahamic
the
Christian
prime cause, the basically the prime cause, the alpha and omega,
Well, so as opposed to the creator that's written about in Genesis, I guess would be the contrast for a monk working from the Bible, and comparing that to Plato. But so in the Bible, the creator supposedly sort of creates with untrammeled creativity, because he's all powerful, no limitations apply. And whereas Plato's demiurge does have limitations, and one of the examples he gives for the limitations working with is a kind of trade-off he had to make when designing human skulls, or when one of the helper gods had to design human skulls, such that if the skull were thicker, it would be better protection for the brain, and like, people would be more sturdy and survivable, but there'd be less space for the brain, and so people would be dumber. And if it was thinner, there'd be more space for the brain, and people would be smarter, but they would get brain damage more easily and be less hardy, and brain would be less protected. So the thickness of the skull is sort of a necessary compromise between sort of survivability and intelligence, which is an interesting little example from that. And then the question you asked was about whether Plato had a motivation for writing this. I think he did. He kind of puts in Timaeus' mouth that this is at best just a likely story, so maybe not to be taken on faith, just a likely account. And later we'll talk a little bit about Plato's attitudes towards myths. That was the last episode we discussed, but Plato was quite bothered by some of the standard elements of Homer and Hesiod's myths about the gods and the origins of creation. There's quite a lot of vicious and very unvirtuous behavior on the parts of the god woven into the story of how things came to be. So I think he wanted, even if he thought it a little fantastical, or just a made-up story about where things came from, in his tale there's a lot less incest and infanticide and patricide and all kinds of really nasty behavior going on in the creation. Just leaves that out of the story, but then also just gives a nod to the other gods, so not to deny their existence or their role in creation, but just sort of have a story about creation that's mythical and references to the gods, but then doesn't include in the story the gods misbehaving very badly.
So kind of didactic also, although it might not be exactly 100% certain that this was how things arose. Maybe he is using the cosmology, even though he probably is certain that this is made up, while he says in the text it's a likely story. He wanted to also impress people with a story that will capture their attention, and then include justifications for people to take virtue seriously, and live their lives following these ethical precepts that contrast quite a lot with the behavior of the standard Homeric or Hesiodic god or hero. So yeah, so that's a possibility. Yeah, Graham, what do you think about this? All of this?
I was going to say, it's like from a technical standpoint, I think Plato would equate more of the ether with what he's using as the receptacle, because that's more of a sense where a lot of the later philosophers who use it on. And so much here is this is Plato basically coming up with these ideas, or at least writing them down for the first time. So it's almost like the pre-mathematician, he's pre-everything here. And it's like when he's dealing with necessity, the example that Nadalian had with the skull is it's sort of an economic puzzle where they're trying to balance competing needs. Need for protection versus sort of a reciprocal that you can't optimize at the same time. And I do think that Plato was he was pretty much summing up all the other philosophers into one, basically pulling them into one system of thought. And a lot of his stuff makes sense there. And it was pretty much as best as he could get it from, what they experienced and the words they had to how reality basically operated. And I see him using, Hesiod as one part of the way he was using it was he was basically trying to touch base with his audience's existing knowledge base. You can't push too far outside the Overton window and still be understood. I was going to say later on, it's like Spinoza pretty much did that. So I'm going to tag out on that.
Okay. So let's move on.
I just before we move on, just on that last point, it sounded, Graham, like you thought he may have had a much more advanced understanding, but that he chose to use his audience's prior knowledge to couch his terms in. And that seems a little surprising, at least to me. Like that, it would make sense, like these days, for someone with a very wide learning, to kind of dumb some of the more advanced stuff down for a general audience. and maybe Plato was doing that to some extent, but he pretty much pulled, I think, most of the sources he had contact with in together here, and I'm not sure how much more advanced his thinking possibly could have been given his exposure and his like he was maybe a genius and erudite genius with a lot of travel experience and exposure to different ideas. But he kind of took the best of all of that and put it in here. So I'm not sure he was necessarily dumbing much down for anyone here. I think this is kind of.
Graham fell precisely when he was going to talk.
We'll give him a minute.
Sure. Yeah, it's difficult to answer this question, but given how he seemed to have drawn from so much of the science available, like all these sources, he seemed to have been trying to build the best accounts possible, technically possible, with the available knowledge during his time, but also with an awareness of the commonplace theology and representation of gods. So he didn't want to be too precise in the scientific arena, so as to create something considered heretic in the theological side.
And I was going to say, now that I'm back, I do agree with everything you said, Nadalian. I wasn't trying to imply that he had more advanced theories. It was more along the lines of, I think for Plato, he was more abstract in his thinking than how he was explaining. And he was using, it's like in his mind, he came to those ideas without the gods, but the easiest way for him to explain it to his audience was to use the gods as a teaching tool, for lack of a better one. But I agree with you. He was not more advanced. He was just pulling together everything he could and making it try to work consistently together. Sorry that it didn't come across that way. Hagen.
No need to be sorry, and thanks for clarifying. Even Peter Adamson was a little bit puzzled about Plato's inclusion of the gods. Is it's unclear whether he seriously believes in the gods and sort of includes that because that's his best guess of what's going on, or if it was an ironic nod with sort of tongue-in-cheek nod to Homer and Hesiod, who in other places he was quite critical of. And perhaps it was just in order to placate the audience, because this is a people who put Socrates to death for sort of teaching heretical teachings about the gods. So trying to avoid a similar fate to his hero by sticking as close as possible to traditional teachings about the gods, while sort of trying to mitigate the, could say, like the unwise teachings about the gods as much as possible. Try to maybe strike a balance between preserving tradition and updating it to a more wholesome state. I don't know. It's unclear what Plato was doing here with the gods inside of the story, or as part of the story.
Yeah, and it contrasts quite a lot with the cosmologies from the Ionians, some of those which didn't include any god at all.
Yeah, if I had to speculate on Plato, I would say there's a good chance he believed in the gods, but the gods were off limits from philosophy, as per Thales. You can't use those as an argument in it, and that's I think there was some aspect of that going on. Again, I don't know how much tongue in cheek or any of the irony aspect of it is. Not sure. Tag.
Adamson mentions a quite amusing passage where Timaeus says that people have their heads upon bodies only so that they don't move around by rolling and get stuck in ditches. And so one has to wonder, if the rest of the text is also to be taken seriously, because that passage is hard to take seriously.
Yeah, one would expect from a real big fanboy of Socrates for Plato to say he doesn't really know about the gods. And so if he's telling a likely tale, sort of keeping the likely tale within tradition and staying out of trouble, but then if you had to press him on it in private, probably say, I don't know about the gods. How would we know about the gods? How would we find out? That's my guess, just based on Socrates' famousness for his claiming ignorance.
Skepticism, perhaps, also.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, so move on.
Yeah.
So this plan or this cosmology reflects in a quite mathematically beautiful conception of the universe, one that is filled with concentric spheres, and it one can imagine how that might have also influenced medieval Christianity as well, with their necessity to refine and update at least their astronomy. And so, yeah, I think this has had some influences in that regard. You guys want to comment on that? Or the next slide is about the elements.
That's a beautiful picture. I was going to ask. I don't recall, or maybe I just wasn't paying attention enough. I don't recall the talk about the spheres of the universe much. Is that does Peterson talk about that at length? Does he just mention that in passing, or did you get that in extra reading about the domains?
Yeah, I tried to get extra reading. The image in the left is supposedly in one of the original copies of Plato's Timaeus from one medieval monk source. It was present in the text as an illustration, and it seems to show different planes of existence. We can see Luna, Sol, Venus, the different planets there, and the Earth. And the one on the right, it alludes to the sphere upon which everything is contained, with the Earth agglomerating more in the middle, like you mentioned, then water and then air, and the aether is the whole thing. And so this was it seems in my research closely associated with Plato's Timaeus and also the early conception of the geocentric cosmology that was prevalent in the Middle Ages.
And I was going to say, this also combines real well with Pythagoras, with that whole idea of music of the spheres concept. And it kind of makes the universe like a musical instrument the demiurge sort of plays. And again, of course, his helpers as well. Pagan.
Okay, and then during the dialogue, Timaeus also mentions the so-called elements, the Platonic solids. So the tetrahedron, icosahedron, hexahedron, which is the cube, dodecahedron, and the octahedron and the dodecahedron. And so these are formed, every single one of them, by triangles in different arrangements. For instance, to form a cube, one just needs to combine pairs of right-sided, right-angled triangles, 2 by 2, to form squares, to form 6 squares, and then you just combine them edge by edge, and they form a cube. I thought it's striking how he tried to explain the behavior of the elements, like fire, since it kind of degrades other material. He conjectured that it is made up of tetrahedron that have sharp edges and that can kind of cut other material, while the air and water are octahedron and icosahedron, which are kind of almost spherical and you can kind of see them flowing together like in a pool of balls, and then the hexahedron or cube can pack nicely together, tightly together, and he kind of tries to explain the stability and toughness of Earth. While the last one, and to me most mysterious one, is the dodecahedron. That is an addition to the system of the four elements that comes from Empedocles, which the dodecahedron is associated with the aether.
Yeah, I quite enjoyed the notion that fire burns and is like violently destructive because it's has these sharp points of the tetrahedron. Quite amusing. Seems to make a bit of sense, but yeah.
I was going to say this kind of strikes me as, in a lot of ways, Plato's version of string theory. We can't necessarily prove it wrong. It sounds really good. It matches a lot of what we see. From a mathematics standpoint, it's really interesting that the tetrahedron stands alone, and the cube and the octahedron are basically duals of each other. If you interchange the vertices and the sides and such. Same thing with the dodecahedron and the what is that one? The
icosahedron.
Icosahedron. Yeah, the water element. Yeah, it's the contrast with the text is not so good.
Well, it's more of I played too much D&D. I think of it as 20-sided dice. So
yeah, and exactly.
It's so much easier to think of that one as opposed to the Greek word. So no, it's interesting mathematically that those are that they're paired and duals to each other. So tag it.
Yeah, that is interesting. I didn't know that. Thanks for sharing that.
But also, well, it wasn't entirely out of the question or entirely wrong. There are exquisite geometrical shapes in molecules that we can actually even image today with atomic force microscopes and tunneling microscopes. We can see the rings of the benzene ring, and we can see these tetrahedral pyramidal structures, the crystalline structures that are formed in the minerals in the earth. Even with the unaided eye, we can see the kind of cubic structures in crystals of bismuth. And this was one of my objections. Why the heck did Plato's Timaeus say that the earth could only be destroyed and reformed by fire and whatnot, but it could not transform into different elements, when you just need to look at the earth and see the hundreds and hundreds of different species of minerals that come out of the earth. Quartz is so different from bismuth, as I mentioned, and pyrite. There are de facto cubes forming in minerals like pyrite, while dirt that is used for agriculture, in contrast to the cubic form of pyrite due to its crystalline structure, it resembles in nothing the attempt to model it or conflate it with cubes, and you can clearly see that different arrangements formed just from earth by mining. Basically, you can mine gold and silver and etc. And the Athenians knew that these treasures were in the earth, and even so, they well, the ones that were using this system of elements, they just said, "Oh, earth." I always wondered about this. I wonder if you guys have ever wondered as well.
Honestly, no. I've spent my time wondering about other things.
I was going to
It's a
say
good observation.
my way to rehabilitate that one for you is that Plato saw it as fire, again, harkening back, bringing something together in the system, fire being what's necessary for them to transform into each other. That they don't really transform in and of themselves, but you apply fire on that one because it would be really well known by that point in time. The whole process between cinnabar and mercury and that sort of transformation, and also you're well into the Iron Age, so they know all about metallurgy and all that, and I'm sure Plato knew about it as well. So I think that might have been where he was coming with. He recognized that those crystalline forms existed, but he was more like you transform them one into each other via fire. They don't do it by themselves, would be my guess. Don't know. Does that make sense, Tag?
Yeah, it makes sense. And to complement what you just said, I remembered when Peter Adamson says that although Plato says that Earth cannot be converted into other elements, Aristotle would go to argue against that position. And well, when we get into Aristotle, we might discuss this also. So a different viewpoint, and maybe an improvement from this view that Earth is just it will be Earth forever and cannot be transformed. And in addition to all this, there was also the notion of conservation of mass. So Plato would say that the elements that transform into others, the components are never destroyed, they just rearrange, which is something that is very dear to the heart of many scientists, material scientists, that they know that the universe really does not accept any utter destruction of anything, only transformation, and also neither creation, as at least in the current state of the universe. Yeah, and this is pretty much what I learned from the Timaeus, and in the following slides we will be looking at the erotic dialogues. Feel free to comment on this one.
Yeah, I was just thinking there may be exception in modern science for things being utterly destroyed, but I may be misunderstanding things. But I thought when antimatter collides with its opposing matter particles, they sort of cancel each other's existence out entirely.
But they supposedly they use the E equals mc square relationship, which is they are converted, I think, entirely or almost entirely into energy. And so we can convert mass between mass with chemical and nuclear fusion and nuclear fission. But there are also these reactions of matter and antimatter that can entirely convert mass into energy.
Oh, okay. No, I thought they kind of just annihilate to nil, but if they convert to energy, then yeah, it's a conversion, not a destruction.
They convert to a lot of energy, though, to explain that we started with mass full atoms, and then ended up with or subatomic particles from atoms, like the protons and antiprotons, or electrons and anti-electrons, and they entirely lose their mass and are converted into photons, or in other exotic, I think, particles. Particle physics is is endless in its zoo of particles, and I cannot claim to be an expert because they have found so many. Well, this is pretty much we. I would also like to just comment because although we kind of take the material properties and the material physical world quite seriously, if we look deep into it, even today, we get amazed and surprised, perplexed even, because most of what we consider matter is mostly comprised of void. And so I always find it intriguing because it's a little bit like looking at a set of a theater, which has kind of cutouts to make the props and whatnot. And the props are basically haphazardly made quickly to have the external appearance, but they might be hollow inside. And so I find it amusing that our matter is quite hollow indeed, quite similar in a comical way. This is not to be taken seriously. I just find it comical that the atoms and subatomic particles are made up, or mostly hollow or made up of void, just like would be props of a theater.
Anything to add to that, Mr. Graham?
Feel free, Graham, if you would like to comment before we go forward.
No, I'm good. I thought you said that very well.
Okay. Thank you for your kind words. It was also just an amusing remark. It's not nothing to be taken too seriously. We still can sit on our chairs, even though we and our chairs, or at least our bodies in our chairs, are mostly void. Okay, so onto platonic love. The so-called erotic dialogues. The first one that we will address is the symposium. Or Socrates hangs out at a drinking party to celebrate a young, brilliant tragedian's win at a competition, a religious competition, and suddenly start arguing about the nature of love. So, yeah, the thing completely went south. And to give a bit of a context, what the heck is this thing of a symposium? We have no conception of this. What is this? So basically, it's a drinking party. And the participants or the guests have a meal without much kind of structure. But then when the meal is over, the drinking party is quite structured, quite ritualized. They appoint a symposiarch who determines how much wine will be drunk and to what extent will the wine be mixed with water. And so this is quite amusing. While nowadays we have the appointed person to not drink and to drive, in those times they had the person that would make sure to what extent everyone else would be drunk.
I don't know. I see some wisdom in that because drinking makes me very sick. But people I know who like drinking complain that their judgment after a couple of drinks for how many more drinks should be drank becomes progressively worse. And so, like, the more they drink, the more they think it's a good idea to drink even more. So if you have one person who's sort of decided ahead of time, this is how much will be drank, then that problem kind of goes away.
Have you ever been to a symposium, Graham?
No, I have not. But I was going to say, it sounds like they were the original bartenders back then. Yeah, this is what you get to drink. I'll make it, and they do it on that one. No, never been to a symposium. I've been to some conventions and stuff, and there's definitely a lot of drinking in the after party. So, tagging.
And also another thing that was striking to me in Peter Adamson's account of the symposium was he alluded to the virtue of temperance quite a bit, even though he didn't mention it directly. He mentioned that many of the guests had been drinking the night before. They were mostly still recovering, still what's the hangover, um, and so they were not temperate by themselves. They were being temperate because their body was already in pain of their excesses, their recent excesses, and so it quite comically represents the intemperate persons that only in a plan of last resort go fetch the virtue of temperance, and only remember the virtue of temperance when things are are going quite bad for them and they're feeling sick. Also, I put up a nice slide listing the guests in this party. So Socrates, the Elenchus guy. Elenchus is the word for the Socratic method. I've discovered, which nicely summarizes what Socrates was doing with all these questions. Agathon was the supposed host of this party. He was the tragedian, and also a beloved of another guest, Pausanias. There was also Aristophanes, coming from the other domain of poetry, a comic poet. We have a guy from the tradition started from Hippocrates, Eryximachus, a doctor. We also have Phaedrus, whom we will know a bit better in the following dialogue. He will be the main titular character of that one. Also, Aristodemos, he is there just to be the kind of secretary, because he is the narrator, the first level narrator, who narrates to another guy who then narrates to us, which is I find quite amusing, this happening. And then Alcibiades, a guy that is considered the dandy by Robert Greene in his works on human nature. I find it quite amusing because the dandy is a guy that is really easygoing. He likes to party and he prizes his self-image quite a lot. And he is not by any measure a temperate guy or a moderate guy. He is a guy of excesses and living things intensely. And then suddenly, Phaedrus provides the idea for the main activity during this symposium, when they are already maybe quite inspired to start performing speeches and talking. Well, in vino veritas, don't they say? And so each of them would go for doing a speech in praise of the god of love. And by this order, Aristophanes would be doing his speech earlier than Eryximachus, the doctor. But funny thing is, Aristophanes is represented quite unflatteringly in this dialogue by Plato. Maybe as a way of Plato's way of getting back at Aristophanes for Aristophanes' portrayal, unflattering portrayal of Socrates. And so Plato gets back at basically representing Aristophanes like a swine. He behaves like a pig in this dialogue, very intemperate, perhaps the most intemperate guy in the entire dialogue. He drinks so much that he starts hiccuping very intensely in such a way that he isn't even able to speak, to perform a speech, and asks the doctor to go in his place. After the doctor fails to heal him of his hiccups by attempting to make him sneeze, which I find really really amusing. Basically, it alludes to the attempt of also modern medicine to replace a problem with another problem. So a person has a health problem, goes to the doctor. Instead of the doctor kind of doing a holistic approach of improving the person's condition holistically as a whole, they give the person a drug that will counteract the health, the disease, but will also bring with itself secondary effects and other problems. And some people even take second and third drugs to counter the secondary effects of drugs. And so what Eric Simakos wanted to do here was to exchange one spasmodic symptom for another, and it's even failed. So I found it really amusing how Plato even managed to insert here a caricature of some of the shortcomings of some of the approaches of medicine, when it is not, like Hippocrates recommends, a holistic approach to the patient as a whole. Rather, Eric Simakos just tried to fix his hiccuping by inserting another problem. Would you?
Wait, yeah. So sorry. You said Aristophanes would go sooner, but then was changed place with, is it
The
Eric
doctor.
C. Marcus? Eric C.
Yeah.
Marcus. After the doctor failed to cure his hiccups.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's funny. It seems likely that Plato would have a bit of a grudge against Aristophanes, given that Aristophanes sort of implied that Socrates was guilty of the things that he was condemned to drink hemlock for. So that would make very plausible.
No, I was going to say this goes to demonstrate why you shouldn't invite Socrates to a symposium. Just can't invite him to a party. But one aspect that's going on here is definitely this seems to be tying into the larger Greek culture of the whole Bacchic rites and everything. Only this is the intellectual version of it. No, we're just getting drunk. We're not worshiping Bacchus. And it's rather interesting, you know. I agree with 100%. He's definitely getting back at Aristophanes, who's probably dead by this point in time. So it's much easier to sit there and just, take the dead man to task for the stuff he did at life. I think Shakespeare commented on that with in the Julius Caesar. So, no, just interesting. It's, again, I've said it a bunch of times, but Plato, the writer, is what really is coming across, just how strong of a creator he was. And you can see he was a playwright before, especially when you have the multi-layered narrator effect. And it's like, no, I didn't say that. That guy that I was writing about was quoting somebody else who said that. Plausible deniability. Tag.
Yeah, there's also this idea that Plato creates a main narrative, a context narrative, which is the symposium, which is an extremely versatile overarching narrative to fit in many sub-narratives. Because people are there, they're inhibited, they will speak their minds, they will they will tend to speak like people we know, people or kind of tipsy will speak, and so, well, it provides a really nice context for him to caricature different characters. And so, to give you guys a flavor of what went down with these speeches, the first one was Phaedrus. Phaedrus, who was the guy who had the original idea, he started first. And he says, love is a mighty God and wonderful among gods and men, but especially wonderful in his birth. Love inspires courage and noble deeds, as shown by Achilles' devotion to Patroclus. And so, yeah, kind of a very Homeric perspective of love. And maybe also Hesiodic. Maybe I'll do them all, and then you guys can comment on different ones that you might find more intriguing. And then Pausanias said, I shall amend Phaedrus by distinguishing between vulgar and heavenly love, and I advocate for the latter, which values virtue and shared interest. So maybe he's getting somewhere. And then the doctor Eryximachus going reluctantly in Aristophanes' stead. Love is a universal force that governs both the physical and spiritual realms, promoting harmony and balance in all aspects of life. So a very Empedoclean kind of account here. And then Aristophanes. Humans were once whole beings with 8 limbs and 2 faces, but Zeus split them in twine, creating a longing for their other half that fuels love. And so basically, this love of the search for the other half that some of you guys might have heard about. And then Agathon, the tragedian. Love is a beautiful and gentle God, inspiring all things good and virtuous and bringing joy, pleasure, and creativity to the world. So, quite an aesthetic and hedonic kind of God. And then Socrates goes, love is the pursuit of beauty and wisdom, ultimately leading to the contemplation of the form of beauty itself, the highest form of love. So, Socrates goes further than the previous speeches and points at the ideals. The thing itself is not visible. The most precious thing is beyond our senses. We can only be reminded indirectly of the thing itself through our experiences in our everyday lives when sometimes something happens that is remarkable, like falling in love or finding that other special person. And we kind of feel very intense emotions, according to Socrates or Plato, because these experiences give us a glimpse at the form of beauty and goodness. And so, yeah, these are the main speeches of the symposium. Feel free to comment and ask me to go back to anyone that might have struck you amusing.
So hang on. Did everybody except the doctor and Socrates call love a kind of God? I'm trying to get sort of
Well,
patterns from here.
Socrates, to be fair, and although I omitted it here for the sake of conciseness, Socrates does not say that love is not a god, but he kind of alludes to Diotima's. He cites Diotima, who you might have heard of before in his speech, and he says that I learned from Diotima that love is a god, yes, but the vulgar form of God. So kind of building on the second speech by Pausanias. The vulgar form of God is a kind of a barefooted, needy kind of God that is deprived, because God is representing this wanting for something outside, for someone else, and is not complete in and of itself. Also, kind of referencing Aristophanes' dialogue or Aristophanes' speech. So yeah, Socrates did not in any way deny that love is a god or a goddess.
All right, so just the doctor then called it a force.
Yeah,
Universal
exactly.
force.
Yeah.
So they're all agreed that it's a god, and then seems they're kind of in disagreement about the kinds of effects it has on people. So the first one said it inspires noble deeds, and yeah, inspires courage and noble deeds. And for another, it inspires creativity and some other things. That was later.
Yep.
Bringing joy, pleasure, agathon, and I guess for Aristophanes, it inspires this longing to join with your other half. And what the doctor said, it produces harmony or moves people to harmony, promoting harmony and balance. Uh, so yeah, I'm trying to get sort of. It seems like these people are pointing to different kind of motives that love involves. I'm just trying to get my head around the space. So love is a kind of God that either inspires noble deeds or inspires the union with one's other half, or it inspires harmony and balance, or it inspires pleasure and creativity, or it, according to Socrates, inspires the pursuit and the contemplation of the form of beauty. That's a try to
That's a
summarize
mouthful.
that.
In my kind of drawing from neuroscience and endocrinology, our current notions of how the nervous and endocrine systems function, even at the level of neurotransmitters and whatnot. I'd say that the more vulgar or base variety of love that Peter Adamson and Frisbee Sheffield were talking about naming eros. To me, it is much more correlated with dopamine, which is kind of like the hormone that when it spikes kind of telling us that what we are seeing, what we are about to reach for, is the thing that we desire. So when people that love chocolate cake see a chocolate cake, dopamine spikes. Or when they see wine, people that are really into wine, they see wine, dopamine spike. And so dopamine is kind of like the correlates to the god Eros, in my view. And while this more refined version of God that brings people together in a more harmonious way and more pro-social way without instrumentalizing each other, rather bringing out the best qualities within us, is way more related to oxytocin, which is the fuzzy feelings and kind of a chill attitude to the other, and harmony between the pairs in a relationship kind of hormone, and it has its highest expression in the mother-child relationship, which is one of the strongest bonds that can be formed between two human beings.
Yeah, I was going to say I'll switch back to Plato in a second. I tend to correlate it the other way, where the oxytocin is more of the first one, where that because it's more of the addiction standpoint, and that's one of the most addictive drugs out there. And I agree with you with the connection with mother and the deep love, but it's the quick hit oxytocin that people are.
Or aren't you maybe alluding to the endorphins? The endorphins are kind of like the payoff hormone. When people take a big dose of heroin, for instance, the major spike that happens in terms of substances, chemical substances in the brain, are endorphins.
Yeah, no, I'm sort of processing there again, and ecstasy, MMDA comes into play here too. It's just I don't think I can quite agree with you with where you're going. It just doesn't seem to align quite right with me, but that's not for this one. Going back to what Plato was writing about, what I struck me is again Plato the writer, where he's using Phaedra to set the old school Greek idea of what love is, the whole idea of Homeric love. And then he uses Pausanias as basically the first pass. Well, there's good love, and then there's bad love, and then you have the doctor. The next one up is talking about it being a spiritual type of love, where love is more of an abstract force. Then you have the Aristophanes dealing with you're dealing the comic writer who Plato assigns the role of addressing the gods themselves and the origins, and again that eight-legged hermaphrodite version of mankind. Then you have he touches on the sensual one with the next one, and then he uses Socrates to bring it all home to the philosophers. And it just seems like he has this natural progression from the Homeric age, and then he sort of teases the ideas apart with his various characters, and then brings them all back together with Socrates. That was what I was coming across to me. Gonna tag, see what you guys think.
Yeah, I think it's a really nice way to encapsulate it. What do you think, Natalia?
Yeah, I like that summary too. Something that I just remembered that was very amusing to me is the story about, or the myth about people starting out as conjoined creatures with 8 limbs. Um, in, included a sort of explanation for where homosexuality comes from and where heterosexuality comes from. So some creatures were 2 males joined together, and some were male and female, and some were female. But the really amusing part of that was then giving an explanation for why homosexual men are more manly men than heterosexual men, which is kind of at odds with more contemporary notions of homosexuality, because like no, the homosexuals are the really manly men because they were made of two men joined together. So there's more manliness in their original being than kind of the androgynous creatures that give rise to heterosexual men and women.
And they didn't even, or rather, Aristophanes didn't even consider the possibility of these 8-limbed characters made only of women.
Oh, he didn't?
At least it seems that he didn't. So they kind of just, the Greeks are so obsessed with men, and look at females like an inferior being. I think not completely, but I think there seems to be this kind of view among some. And so, it had to be Socrates to mention a female other than the flute players that were quickly dismissed when they started to realize, let's talk about love. And they focused mainly about the love between an older man and a younger boy, a teenager, before he has his first beard. So also to complement the context, all this love, most of it is basically them thinking about these kinds of relationships that were, for the most part, kind of sanctioned between the Athenian elite, the members of the Athenian elite. And it was kind of ritualized or regulated by them kind of shunning teens that would become more like prostitutes and gain money or something like that by offering their bodies, while the older men that would be too aggressive, they would also kind of shun, because the older men, there was an expectation that they would also provide something of value to the younger boy as a form of introduction to the adult world, to the world of the polis, to explain them what is what in the adult world, and etc. So the ancient Greeks seem to kind of look at this like a normalized thing, while nowadays, of course, and Peter Adamson emphasized this in his episodes, that of course today pederastic relationships are viewed with great disgust and also illegality, while although there are suspicions that still nowadays the global Athenian elite, it might not be so different from the Athenian elite after all. But that is a story for another another investigation. And so Socrates mentions one of his main teachers, and I kind of believe that she really existed, because I have a hard time thinking about a person that was included in the dialogues, in Platonic dialogues, that was not a real person. For the most part, the people that are cited or that are characters in the dialogues were actual real people that, in a sense, are being caricatured or mythologized by Plato. And so I kind of believe that Diotima might have existed and actually gave lessons regarding to love and ethics and also maybe rhetoric to Socrates. And so she would say, while all kinds of desire might be considered love, it is only appropriate to use that term to one particular kind of desire, the desire that exists between two human beings. And so she thinks that eros should be used for stuff, and philia should be used between people, and philia is the only conceivable love that is of worth between human beings. The relationships that they were talking about should be kind of reformed and improved upon. And although there can be mentorship between older males and older adults and younger adults or teens, like might happen nowadays, it should be a relationship exclusively of the minds, and not a relationship where possession of the body of the beloved is a thing, or should be a thing, because it really doesn't contribute anything to bring out the best of the both the pairs in the relationship. It might even contribute to their corruption, and also when it also introduces an element of a conflict of interest. The older man actually kind of has an interest that the younger, the beloved in the relationship, is weak and falls into his grasp and his seeking to attain him. And we can also kind of see the equivalent to this in today's relationships that sometimes happen between older adults and younger adults that are a bit less capable, and so there is some kind of foundation to do a critique of these kinds of relationships, where one element of the pair is more powerful, and the relationship and it ends up lopsided. And so yeah, this is kind of like my reading of this. Feel free to comment, guys.
Yeah, that was quite a lot. Sort of my mind went a bit adrift reading Diotima's sort of statement that like all love is desire, and but that like only desire between like all kinds of desires can be considered love, but that it's really only proper to consider desire between people love. I recently read sort of very contemporary philosophy of emotion, and even with emotion, like there are different schools that conceptualize emotion either as feelings that may or may not be related to any kind of desire, or sort of cognitive appraisals, so belief-like judgments of things being good or bad in certain ways, or desires and motivations after things. And so it seems like most of these ancient Greeks would fall into some kind of motivational theory of love. Although like, I think in contemporary conceptions of emotion, they wouldn't call emotions gods. But yeah, it's just an interesting observation that like, only one of them mentioned pleasure. And I guess Socrates kind of mentioned the desire for knowledge of the beautiful, like the form of beauty, but not too much in the ways of cognitive appraisals of sort of the goodness of the beloved, at least not explicitly. Do you guys recall them discussing sort of judgments of the goodness rather than desire for the goodness? I think they do talk about the desire for what's good in people. not necessarily judgments, and very little talk of feelings other than just pleasure.
And also the feeling of desire as well.
Yeah, I guess desire, like, it does feel like something to have a desire.
Kind of like a longing, like when people are apart and one of them kind of it has a crush on the other, and they're thinking about them all the time. And when the other person appears suddenly, they kind of their heart rate goes up because of the intrinsic effects of the conditioning that they have regarding that person. They kind of have a strong conditioning that formed somehow through the process of forming of that crush, as people use this term nowadays.
Yeah, no, what I see her doing was basically working on the definitions. And, when it's legitimate to call it love and when you should be calling it something else. And I think that's kind of relevant considering how many different words the Greeks were parsing it into. And it's like she's basically saying you can't love, an object. You can't love, an activity. You can it's only love if it's, the target is a human being. And speaking on the whole older man, younger boy, that was long-term established tradition there, and it went well into the Roman Empire. And a lot of Romans, that was where that was the beginning of your career. And that's where, like a lot of Roman emperors and stuff, they always had those relationships. And that's where it's like, Hadrian and Trajan, there's thought that there was, relationship there. Again, Julius Caesar and Augustus, almost certainly there was. And, it was seen as just a natural progression, rite of passage in life. That's how you got through society. Sort of like today, you go to college and you graduate. That was sort of their version of it. And none of them saw it necessarily as nefarious or something wrong. It was just sort of how you did things. I'm going to tag on that and see what you guys think.
Yeah, I want to really quickly jump on the comment about how many different words they were using to parse it into. For one thing, the point I made about desire would seem kind of logical because they were using the word eros, which I think it would translate to well as any kind of strong desire. So it could be a strong sexual desire, or even a strong appetitive desire, strong desire to eat something, or just a strong desire to meet someone or to do something. So like eros, very much related to desires. And then slightly on a different note, I've heard in my life just so many times people like praise the Greeks for having so many different words for love, whereas in English we only have the word for love. And I've recently been looking through a bunch of different words for emotions and feelings, and really English has quite a lot of different words for love. And I commented in a tweet, replied to one of Rogerio's tweets, just a bunch of English words to use. So it won't take long, so I'll quickly list them off. There's, among others, adoration, affection, attachment, altruism, benevolence, closeness, compassion, devotion, infatuation, intimacy, kindness, liking, lust, goodwill, passion, romance, tenderness, and warmth. So like the Greeks aren't the only people who had many different words for subtly different kinds of love. Like English also has a bunch of different words, and English obviously picked those up from other languages because that's kind of what the English language does, just kind of agglomerates from a bunch of other languages. But yeah, so that's just a comment. The Greeks had a couple of different words for love, but English also does, and I guess other modern languages also have a bunch of different words for different kinds of love.
I would say that the main takeaway from that is not to disparage English in contrast to ancient Greek, but to actually work, pay your dues to increase your vocabulary, to learn a bit more about the etymology of the words that are available in your own language, the language you're fluent in, so that you can be more a better communicator and communicate more clear, not just with other people, but with yourself, by parsing your own emotions, your own internal states. And I think that this cannot be overestimated, the importance of this.
Yeah, part of my point with the Greeks having so many words for love isn't so much compared to English as it is compared to the lack of many words Greeks had for a lot of other ones. They had a much more limited vocabulary, and love was one of the ones that they definitely, love, knowledge. A lot of those were words that they very much had lots of them for, compared to, like horse and
Snow.
that's the concept. Yeah, snow, tag.
Yeah, the richness of a vocabulary associated with a single concept, like snow with the Inuit peoples, who kind of have like 20 words for different types of snow. It is related to their direct experience, to the concepts in which the culture develops in. And the Greeks had sometimes snow, but they weren't living around snow. They were living around the sea. And so maybe they had a lot of proverbs relating to sea and seafaring and stuff like that. But yeah, I think we could move forward if you guys are okay.
Yeah,
So,
to the Phaedrus.
Works for me.
A quick callback to the ladder of love that we mentioned in a previous episode. So the kind of idea that the concept of love, or the association that people make between the symbol called the word love and the concept of love itself. The concept should be rehabilitated and improved upon, so that it is a concept that when people use it or reference it with the word love, instead of love being a very overburdened word, love being exclusively used or more used to the best example or the best concept of the thing itself, which is something that can improve two people that are together, can bring the best of them and refine or improve their character, or at least facilitate self development in the kind of way that people that really care about each other, they are rooting for each other, instead of kind of judging how they are currently right now, and comparing incessantly with other people to figure out if they have to make a switch between people or not. And so, yeah, I clearly I think that's a discussion on the application of the word of love is worthwhile. And well, that is that. Let's move forward to the Phaedrus, if you guys want. So okay, before the Phaedrus, of course, unexpectedly Alcibiades appears. He is represented to the left, with the garland of leaves on his head, and in the middle is Agathon. Socrates is to the right, sitting down and kind of almost putting his hands to his head in kind of ashamed of Alcibiades, how Alcibiades turned out, despite the attempts of Socrates to make him into someone of worth. And then Alcibiades, he confesses his love for Socrates, does a speech in praise of Socrates. I confess my love for Socrates, praise his wisdom, virtue, and beauty. He is a mysterious figure who has the power to resist physical desire. He resisted his advances. And instead guides others toward the pursuit of true knowledge and self-improvement. I admit my own inability to resist Socrates' influence and acknowledge true love lies in the pursuit of wisdom rather than mere physical attraction. One just has to ask, and so if you agree with it, why don't you do it? Why why are you still living an intemperate life? And so, yeah, this is I think Plato giving a quintessential example of a person that is all talk but no action. He doesn't walk the walk, he just talks the talk.
Interesting. I was wondering whether Plato might be projecting some of his own love for Socrates and putting it in the words of Alcibiades.
Yeah, maybe his fanboyism of Socrates.
But he's also doing it tongue-in-cheekish, because it's almost like Socrates is looking at it as Alcibiades, my greatest failure.
Yeah.
I tried to teach you, you just didn't learn it, and you're loving me even though you didn't learn any of my lessons. What's up with this?
Yeah, it's so perplexing.
Tag.
There was also in the final part of Adamson's interview of Sheffield, Frisbee Sheffield. I loved her name. Her name is awesome. And they referenced this part in the end of the symposium where Socrates says, the same people who are able to write good tragedy should also be able to write good comedy. And I found this really interesting and intriguing. I would like to give you guys my reading, and then you can say if I have say what you think about it. Which is the excellent tragedian slash comedian is by necessity a guy that dominates the true knowledge of human nature. And besides that, he is also in possession of a good ethic of when he's doing his creative production. He not only correctly represents human nature, but he also tries to pull it upward in direction to the form of the good. And that's why I believe Socrates says that the guy that could be a good tragedian of excellence could also be a good comedian, because the technique that is involved here, besides writing well, is also the knowledge of psychology, literally.
Yeah, I think that's fair enough. So it seems that quite clear that there should be at least shared skills and knowledge between people who can write good tragedy and people who can write good comedy. So knowledge of psychology being shared is one of them. Knowledge of how to write, just the technique of writing a good story, would be common to both. To the plot lines would be slightly different, but a lot of the sort of the gimmicks and the techniques that writers use to make their writing compelling or their stories compelling would be similar between the two. I'm not so convinced that really tugging at people's heart with a like very sad tragedy is exactly the same knowledge of psychology that it is to be able to really make people laugh. So knowing how to tickle people to laugh specifically and knowing how to make people cry seems to be like two different things, at least in one respect. So that in some respects, the writer will have overlapping skills. But yeah, if from Socrates' point of view, is that sort of knowledge of human nature is more sort of the knowledge of what's good for people. And so the tragedian would know what's bad because they know what's good. And so they can write a story about things kind of falling apart in a bad way, in a way that's very moving because they have a clear knowledge of the good, or at least some kind of intuition or a a sign or a daemon that sort of guides them. And similarly, for what makes people laugh and brings people joy would also be the good. I think Socrates would phrase it in terms of the good rather than in terms of people's souls or human nature. But yeah, I tend to think of it as more in terms of human nature, understanding people's emotions and how to tug on people's emotions. Although I do think it's a little different tugging on people's sort of sad sentiments and their more playful emotions. So I'm not sure they're like
plucking plucking their heartstrings versus tickling them, basically.
Yeah, so I don't think those are exactly the same skills, and I do think it's conceivable for a person to be really good at one and not so good at the other. But if you're writing, then you'd have to be good at writing for both. But then like, someone could be quite a good writer and be neither a good tragedian or a good comedian. I'd be a very good technical writer or a good educational writer. Anyway, that's some of the things I thought about that.
One of my takes on it was that this is Plato, the writer, sitting there and taking a slam at pretty much the playwrights and such of the day, because the general rule is that it's easier to write good tragedy than it is good comedy. And one of the reasons is that so much of tragedy is universal, like death and sickness and disaster, and happiness tends to be, in comedy tends to be a lot more idiosyncratic. So it's tougher to find some of those universal comedic points unless you're going with, slapstick and body humor. But, it seems like Plato's trying to run, riff off of that sort of concept here. And I agree with everything Nerdalian's saying, where it's sort of like writing is taking the ideas and feelings and such and putting them into words. And that requires a certain skill set between, the relationship of understanding and how to manipulate words. And then you have understanding psychology above that. And, a lot of people don't understand, most people don't understand themselves very well, myself included. It makes it harder to write other people. So I'm going to tag on that point.
Okay, I would like to give two examples. One from the Platonic corpus, the Ion, which was not a reference in Peter Adamson's episodes. The Ion features Socrates talking with a guy called Ion who writes, who declaims Homer, basically. He is an expert on Homer and declaims Homer, so he shows to be rather incompetent. Outside the domain of Homer, he knows nothing about the other Sophocles, Euripides, whatnot. He doesn't care for them. So he has kind of an eros, I would say, for Homer, in a way that is lopsided and exclusive. It's in Socrates' conception, it's almost like the gods have given him an insight or an excellence only on Plato and left the rest outside. So the dialogue kind of concludes that this Ion guy, he is not an excellent poet. He is just a Homer fanboy. And to bring this to another more contemporary example, we have George Carlin, who started very early by writing his own material. And he would write rather comedic takes on society, even deep and serious issues like even abortion and the contrast between the haves and have-nots, or the politically correct kind of euphemistic language that he railed incessantly about, and he made multitudes laugh quite a lot. His It's Bad for You show was very philosophical in nature. You can see inspirations from the cynics, Socrates, even the Stoics there, quite easily. Even though he never directly cites his inspirations, but it's tantalizing to think that he draws from these guys. And he shows the tragedy of the human condition very explicitly, even though he's constantly joking about everything. And so I think that if I would be called to name a guy that is an excellent writer and writes good comedy and also comments on tragic affairs of human beings, George Carlin would be a name that would pop out.
Yeah, I think George Carlin is a good candidate. I don't know that he's ever really written much tragedy per se, but like his comedy, his stand-up shows is full of a lot of tragedy.
It's kind of like tragic comedy. It joins, I think, both.
Yeah, shout out to George Carlin.
Yeah, wherever you are, George Carlin, you are deeply missed. You went way too soon. You should have gotten extra 20 years for sure. He was just kind of like starting to go really up in the really philosophical social commentary with very hilarious takes on stuff that is problematic in society, with really nice argumentation. And so he didn't do many appeals to emotion like crappy creatives often do, and spin doctors and whatnot. He would really give it really dry and point out really glaring problems with society, like the allegory of the guy that points out that the king has no clothes. Yeah, so he's a really nice comedian that I recommend everyone to check on. He's a modern day guy that wanted to do something similar to what Plato wanted to do in the ancient times. And feel free to comment on what I just said, but we can also go forward.
I think we can go forward. Graham, it seemed like you had a bit of a technical thing.
Oh yeah, no, I'm here again. It's basically connection challenges again. You have electricity challenges. I get connection challenges sometimes. What I was going to say on Carlin there is part of he's following in a tradition that it's part of the absurdist, surrealist sort of school of genre writing, and dates back to Alfred Jarre, and it's basically it's making fun of the absurdity of life. And that's where you use tragedy as basically an element for comedy, and Carlin did it fantastically. I always love some of his pieces. Like it's a big group, and you're not in it.
Yeah.
Tagging out.
Okay, so let's talk about the Phaedrus as well. So Socrates and young Phaedrus chat outside Athens the morning after the youth has heard Lysias, a prominent Athenian and famous orator, give a speech against love. It was also a speech that enumerated why Lysias should lay in bed with him. Rather, why Phaedrus should lay in bed with the older Lysias. The setup is Lysias, a man not in love, is to be favored over one who is in love, since love is madness and distorts the lover's reason. Such a man will act neither in his own best interest nor that of his beloved, and the relationship with such a person can only lead to harm and regret. In other words, conflict of interest. Then Socrates critiques Lysias' position on love by discussing writing, speech, rhetoric, failure, kind of discussing the techne of the thing mainly, and his inability to define terms, and how he kind of structures, how Lysias kind of structures the speech in a way that has no beginning, middle of or end. He could just swap the lines and it's the same thing. It wouldn't change. Socrates argues on Lysias' terms and is about to leave when his divine sign compels him to realize his mistake, to make amends and do an improved speech. So this dialogue is very characteristic by having first the Lysias speech that Phaedrus reads, and then Socrates gives a kind of crappy but better speech on love, better than Lysias, but it would not be very difficult. But still, his speech didn't make justice to love. And then Socrates goes on to give a second, more truthful account, supposedly truthful account on love. And there is this sculpture that has been in my parents' house so many years. This is the one, and the allegory that Socrates gives in the Phaedrus. It uses the imagery of a charioteer with two horses, and they are actually even two winged horses. A white horse who is more virtuous and tends to pull the chariot upward in direction to the realm of the gods and where the forms are and whatnot. And the second horse is a black horse, and it represents the passions and desires, and it tries to pull the entire thing downwards to a more earthly realm of existence. Uh, much more related to vices and viciousness. And so when two people come together and they manage to with each other's help correct the behavior of their respective horses, of their respective souls, people experience pains and discomfort, which kind of can be explained as, according to Socrates, the regrowth of the wings of their soul. And it is through the study of philosophy as friends or lovers that one can turn this yearning after the quest for real truth and goodness into a pursuit that's actually goes somewhere in this upward movement to a higher purpose than would be physical gratification, which would be more characteristic of a relationship more based on sex, or when people claim that they are friends, but they are actually are kind of drinking partners or just partners to check on sports and whatnot, and they don't go anywhere. They just go in circles in a friendship. So Graham, you are having technical issues once again. So I was mentioning the better speech of Socrates and the allegory of the charioteer. Are you familiar with it, Graham?
Yeah, no, I'm familiar with it, and I caught almost everything you said. I popped back in as instantly as you dropped. Go ahead and finish up.
Okay, so to summarize what I was saying when I think you dropped out is people, when they come together in a virtuous relationship that is not obsessed with physical gratification, they can actually facilitate each other's improvement, very much in the style of what we previously heard about in Socrates' reference of Diotima in the Symposium, but here in another form with the allegory of the chariot, in which um, I don't know for sure how Socrates goes from the allegory of the chariot to the wings growing in the actual soul, but as the chariot is the metaphor for the soul, maybe the both horses, the white one and the black, grow wings, and so both horses are in a better condition to have a consistent upward movement instead of kind of conflicting with one another. The horse of the higher ambitions of the pursuit of truth, the white horse, and the black horse that kind of goes to the basest desires of physical gratification and etc. And so, yeah, this is my reading of the allegory of the charioteer and the two horses.
Yeah, so something I'm wondering about is I think the Phaedrus is one of the middle dialogues, if I remember correctly. And it's interesting, Plato seeming to augment Socrates' notion of desire being for like of a unitary kind towards what's good, and the good sort of being this overarching thing that one can have knowledge over, and that's why sort of knowledge of the good, and like people not being able to or not making sense to say that people have conflicting desires. Whereas in this allegory seems like a soul that sort of split in parts that can be pulling in different directions, and so at least with this kind of image, it seems like there may be a horse that knows the good and wants to pull the soul in the direction of the good, and yet there's a part of the soul that's dragging the soul in a different direction. I think Socrates probably would have thought that doesn't make any sense, but Plato seems to put this kind of speech in Socrates' mouth later in Plato's career, long after Socrates is dead, 20 odd years later. So that's an interesting.
Phaedrus is a middle dialogue. I checked.
Yeah, so that's just an interesting difference between like a building on top of what Socrates did by sort of I think correcting Socrates on the possibility of inner conflict. And then another interesting note is there are several traditions where I think people would sort of say that the job of the charioteer is to get rid of the black horse entirely. And I don't think Socrates is trying to make that point. I think the job of the charioteer is to try to tame both horses and get them both working together in a good way. And I'm kind of speculating here, but I think Plato may be a little bit sensitive to there being some point to Aristophanes' charge of philosophers with their heads in their clouds, being too detached from reality. And I think he even himself makes fun of, I think of Thales, recounting a story of Thales falling in a puddle because he was contemplating the clouds too much. So I think Plato was sensitive to like what a charioteer and a chariot might turn into if they got rid of the black horse and would become a completely impractical, theoretical soul that is only contemplating the forms and sort of completely detached from more concrete earthly needs of, like, say, hunger and thirst and sort of procreating and raising children and doing sort of the more material stuff, the more earthly stuff.
Yeah, but Socrates drinked in the symposium. Socrates laid down with Alcibiades, even though nothing happened. But he was not a man of being completely fleeing away from contexts of social or physical gratification. He lived his life like earthly, as well, not just with his head in his clouds.
Yeah, so those are the two interesting things that stand out for me. So the introduction of and actually he does a similar thing in the Republic as well. So like in the middle dialogues, Plato definitely seems to have a conception of the soul that can be in conflict with itself, like different parts of the soul pulling in different directions, and then also seeming to say that, well, at least when it comes to love, getting rid of the passions is not what you want to do. Is you kind of want to use reason to get the passions and that part of your soul that longs after virtue and sort of knowledge of the theoretical kind of sort of theoretical ethics kind, especially to get them pulling in the same direction, to sort of steer them.
Maybe they represent reason and passion. I'm not 100% sure, these two horses, but it might be that is what they are representing. And I think that I'm not so familiar with the Jungian model, but I think that there is quite some prescription to try to integrate the shadow, a part of our personality, instead of just sweeping it under the rug. Do any of you guys know about this? Or
I believe Graham is a big fan of you.
Yeah, I don't know about fan. It's like I very much like his system. Some of how Young lived his life is questionable. Um, but I was going to say, I'll tie that in a second. My first one I wanted to comment on was about the structure that Plato used here. And he's using that technique. It's like, I don't know about you guys, but I have several friends that they'll finish a speech like that and then turn away, and then it goes, oh, and another thing. And again, that was used to good help with, to good effect with the the infomercials here in the U.S. with the but wait, there's more. And where I'm going with the charioteer is the idea of it's basically riding herd on the left side, right side of the brain. You're trying to balance the two sides of yourself, thinking and feeling. Again, the rationality and the passion aspect. And what Plato's doing is extending it from the your inner conflict with yourself into a relationship with another person as well. And some of this goes into the mythological interpretation of the idea of wings usually correlates with, the sky, the higher, the spiritual. It's like a higher level of consciousness, as opposed to, that's where the bird snake conflict that you see so often in mythology. It's the higher levels versus the lower levels. And the snake is much more of the sensual, the expedient, the necessary, as opposed to the higher level. And that's where you see a lot of interplay between the two of those in the mythology. And I'm definitely seeing this one as the charioteer is you trying to ride herd on your two sides and bring them evenly yoked, as they say in the Bible. Going to tag on all that, see if that makes sense to you guys.
Yeah. Pretty good. Thanks, Graham.
Yeah, it makes mostly sense, although I don't think the left side and the right side of the brain specialize in different, like, I think the way they specialize is a bit more nuanced than just thinking and feeling. But
oh, absolutely. I was going to say, if you want that one, go to McGilchrist's Master and the Emissary.
Yeah, there's also the limbic part of the brain that is much more related to irrational behavior, maybe even passions and whatnot, while the outer brain, the secondary brain is more related to our mammalian socialization, and then the outer cortex is related to creativity and analytical rationality, etc. And I think also houses the consciousness.
yeah, so those are like so two very highly simplified models of the brain. The one model has this left side, right side model of the brain, and the left side does analytical thinking stuff, and the right side does creative feeling stuff. It's not quite right. There's something to it, but it's very simplified of how things work. And then another very simplified things of how things work is the sort of layers. So you have the brainstem, that's the reptilian stuff that does basic things like heart rate and digestion and like basic visceral stuff. And then on top of that, there's a limbic system. It's called the mammalian brain that does emotion stuff and relationship stuff. And then on the outside of that, there's the cortex that does abstract thinking and planning and visualizing stuff. There's a little bit to that, but it's also highly simplified. But like, at least with those two highly simplified things, the thing that would make more sense would be to say the brainstem is the black horse, and the white horse is the limbic system, and the charioteer is the cortex.
Perhaps, yeah, it's not out of the question. It kind of makes sense. And very recently, the seat of consciousness has been narrowed down by studies on brain trauma. So kind of like these retrospective studies where they figured out, of course, consciousness is not in the spinal cord nor in the cerebellum, because people who have had their spinal cord severed or their cerebellum removed are conscious nonetheless, and no cognitive faculties are altered. And they experience the world pretty much the same, but without either having the ability to move their bodies or having motor coordination. And of course, there is some fuzzy specialization between the regions of the brain, but it's not clear cut, as I think you were alluding to. It's very difficult to delimit very nicely. This part of the brain only controls numbers or something like that, and this part of the brain only controls the appreciation for visual aesthetics, for instance. It's very, very hard because the neurons that are involved in these activities probably are dispersed throughout the gray matter.
Yeah, no, that's why I agree both of those are too grossly oversimplified. That's why I was referencing Ian McGilchrist and his work, because he's very nuanced on it. And a lot of what he comes up with is it's the interplay between the two sides is where the action happens. So, you need to look at which parts of the brain are dual, like the right and left hemispheres and such, and which are more singular, like the corpus callosum, the pineal gland, some of the more unitary functions. And there's an interplay between the unitary functions and the dual parts of the brain, the various dual parts. Just going to tag, and just it's a general idea, and we're far beyond Plato, so tag.
Yeah, and there's also this possibility that people that have a more upstanding character or capable of more temperance have a much better connection between the two halves of the brain, and also better connection for the temperance case between the cortex and the limbic system. So the kind of reins of the charioteer, that is kind of like the conscious awareness or the consciousness or the soul, is much better connected, or is grabbing the reins much better to the part of the brain that is more animal instinct in nature, in a sense, if that makes sense to you guys.
That makes
Yeah.
a better sense, but yeah, this is not a neuroscience study.
We're dealing with Plato, the proto-neuroscientist, so tagging.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would also like to mention that one of the things that struck me in the end of the Phaedrus was this, that Socrates said: writing is far inferior to speaking. Writing should be used as a memory aid, but not as a preferred method of communication. A written document cannot respond to questions or engage in dialogue with its reader. Once words are put on the page, they cannot be clarified if unclear, or if they need to be improved. No matter what happens or who reads it, the document will continue to say the same thing forever. And so this is perhaps an explanation of why Plato wrote in a dialogue form instead of writing in his own voice. And well, for everyone writing a book, it's added pressure.
Well, I was thinking that may be an explanation for why Aristotle wrote in lecture notes. So just notes to aid memory, with the understanding that like the teaching happens in conversation, not from reading the notes.
Yeah.
Makes sense. It's like I said before, plausible deniability on Plato's part. I didn't say that. My characters did.
Yeah, exactly. A technique that was used by much later by people like Nietzsche with his Zarathustra. I didn't say that. It was the crazy prophet that lived in the mountain with an eagle and a snake that said that. And who talked to these animals, and these animals talked back to him. So I'm off the hook. And the final episode on Plato by Peter Adamson went into Plato's approach to and engagement with poetry and myth of his age. Peter Adamson mentions the three bodies of text existing in Greek literature: the philosophical scientific works, history, like from Thucydides and Herodotus. Then there was poetry. which could be epic, tragic, or comic. These are the main forms. And it could be Hesiod, Homer, Euripides, Sophocles, Aristophanes, many authors. And Plato was heavily critical, just like Xenophanes, of the portrayal of the gods in the epic poems. And he criticized these depictions of the gods in several parts of the Republic, as I've understood. He even, by this critique, and while delineating his republic, he goes so far as to propose a program of censorship for saying that specific verses should be banned. I'm not so sure exactly what verses are, but Peter Adamson alludes to verses that represent the gods badly or show the gods doing um, uh, evil acts or something like that. But Plato could not ignore poetry because it was so popular and so important in Greek society, especially aristocratic Greek society. So he had to address it and to address its social implications. And a quote by Plato would go, "Unless the poets or their adherents can show us that poetry is beneficial to society, they too will be excluded," in Plato's Republic. And so Plato makes several complaints against the poets, which I boil down to 6. So poets are engaging in mimesis or imitation, and the poet is able to slip false teachings into the minds of his listeners. Or poets instill false beliefs about the gods, especially sinister in its effects on the young who are more impressionable. And this is more or less the angle of Xenophanes as well. Or poets depict heroes being overly emotional or dishonest, which is actually rather unfitting traits for individuals with upstanding characters that should be role models. Poets must only represent role models as being completely noble. And the next one is some modes of music, which music was, remind you, very intertwined with poetry. Poetry was always declaimed with music, or almost always. And so he said some modes of music induces emotions that are corruptive for society. For instance, sorrow or uncontrolled passion. And then for the fifth one, he said, theater gives license to express emotions in a way they would normally find people would normally find shameful, like uncontrollably wail and weep at the sight of pitiable events in a tragedy, or laugh without abandon, provoked by comedy with degrading jokes like toilet jokes. Or the poets are aiming at pleasing their audience, not educating their audience. And this is maybe one of the strongest ones. And some of these critiques even are applicable today when we look at, for instance, the music industry or the cinematic industry. We see a lot of productions that are put together using a very formulaic kind of list of ingredients or a kind of a list or prescription. And so many movies that are very popular, they kind of are popular because people are already trained or conditioned to like these kinds of films that have these kinds of structure, and so they keep on making these films or telling these stories with this structure to please their audience, and often there is lacking a ludic or didactic component in these creations. And so, well, this is pretty much what I have. I'm going to shut up and let you guys comment as well.
Yeah, so I think that conflicting interest of pleasing the audience versus educating the audience maybe is overarching to most of those things. So I think that would be maybe at the root of the criticisms of sort of poetry being an imitation that teaches false teachings and gives a false portrayal of the gods and gives a false portrayal of heroes, where instead of educating instead of the goal of educating the audience with the truth, the poems are written to be engaging emotionally, maybe more than pleasing. So written as to have a effect on the audience, evoke strong emotions, and yeah. So if he maybe rephrase that as to emotionally engage an audience versus to just educate them, rather than to please them versus to educate them. Because I mean, emotionally engaged, if people start crying, it's odd to say they're pleased. But they are often pleased to then speak to their friends about the poem they've seen that made them cry. So it's a way for people to bond if they have shared experiences of intense emotions that they can bond over and talk about, even if the emotions are unpleasant. So if something's very frightening, so people today still go watch horror movies. They'd be quite unpleasant. But it's a bonding experience. People do all kinds of fairly unpleasant things together, or just to have had the experience so that they can then talk to others who've had the same experience and bond with them over it. I don't think Plato is really sensitive to the community building and the bonding benefits of poetry, or of, like, say, I guess the arts more generally, so music and paintings and stuff too. But yeah, so he uses a lot of the same trappings, but I think in his mind he's trying to reach for truth and teach people truth and hold up good role models. He also does show them bad role models, but I think Peter Adamson makes the good point that like the audience should be encouraged to think for themselves which are the good role models to follow and which are the bad role models to follow, and often Plato's bias shines through, and sometimes it's not clear who to follow, so like an honest perplexity at the end of it. So he uses a lot of the same tools that the artists use, the poets use, but I think he's using them with a educational purpose and a sense and research. So yeah, basically saying poetry is bad if it's not purely education and research, which I think is a little unfair, because I think there's some room in life for just a respite from the drudgery and boredom and awfulness of real life sometimes. And I do think some of the more evocative things can be quite helpful for bonding with people. I would almost want to say the majority of small talk conversations I hear are either, well, at least in the circles I move, are usually about series or movies that people watch. They'll be talking about the stories they've been watching. People really bond over that kind of thing. Somewhat over sports too, but like sports have this team aspect to it that's more divisive. So if people kind of stick out feelers, if people are on the same fans of the same sides, if they find someone who's a fan of the same side, then they'll talk about sport. Otherwise, they'll avoid it. But most people really keen to talk to anyone who's watched the same series as them, or even keen to ask for recommendations of series that they should watch. And I'm guessing the Greeks were similar. Like if it was a particularly heartbreaking story, they'd be talking about that to anyone and everyone who'd be willing to listen about that story for a long time, and referencing it whenever like really something sad happens in their lives, the way that people these days still do. So yeah, I guess my comment is, I think Socrates is right to point out that, not Socrates, Plato, right to point out that people can get a misleading idea, and like false beliefs can be planted into people's heads. But I don't think he's giving enough credit to the power of those kinds of stories to help people bond and to give respite from drudgery and suffering of life.
Yeah, I was going to say, my take on it is this is Plato's political theory sticking its head out from behind the curtain. And his idea is that these should be done, basically poetry and such should be done in alignment with the state and promoting citizens that would be good for the state. And it's almost, and again, in reference to the, I was going to say, Plato's treating him almost like the sophists, that these poets are basically like sophists, where they're using more of the rhetoric stance in order to manipulate the audience in different ways. And he's basically saying they should only be manipulated into the state's to the state's goals, and that's why he's big on the censorship there. And as far as the appealing to the audience, I think the reason we have movies and such the way we do today isn't so much appealing to the audience as it is appealing to the stockholders. And they need to have the confidence that if they spend $100 million on something, they're going to make it $200 million back. And they do that based off of other things that have made hundreds of millions of dollars. So that's why you see such repetition. Going to tag on that.
Yeah, nicely complements why, or makes a nice comparison between the ancient and the contemporary. To address the point that Plato doesn't seem to value stories, which arguably storytelling is inextricably connected with human socialization and civilization, etc. It's a really essential and unavoidable ingredient of what it means to be human, to share stories. Plato also shared stories or myths of his own, like we listened to in the Timaeus, although it's kind of like a scientific myth, but it's more or less in the same kind of regime as a Hesiod would be. There's also the myth of Ur in the Republic, where Plato describes this young man called Ur, who had a near-death experience and returned from the realm of the dead, and then he tells what he experienced while he was near the gates of the underworld, or either. So they were not just the gates for the underworld, but they were the gates to the isles of the virtuous peoples. And there's also the allegory of the winged horses in the Phaedrus, also another myth. And so, yeah, Plato didn't shy from creating his own myths while he was criticizing the myths of others, which can sound like kind of dissonant and incoherent. But at the same time, to his credit, he, I think, does his best to make his own stories as didactic as possible, with some intellectual honesty and humility when he doesn't know the absolute truth. I think it's rare to see in Plato's works an instance where the author seems to say that he is completely sure about something related to cosmology or human nature. As far as I know, he does never seem to do that. While the other creators and the ancient Greek literature didn't seem to take these to employ this good practice as much. And well, yeah, passing the ball to you guys.
Yeah, I definitely think it would be a mistake to call him a hypocrite for writing myths and using the same tools that the poets use. I think he's really clear that it's not the tools themselves, it's the ends that poets put them to, like the way they're employed, that he's criticizing. And so he uses them in quite a different way that's aligned with the values that are behind his criticism. So I don't think it's hypocritical of him. So just to clarify, I think in his in sort of the values that underlie his criticism, I was kind of making the point that I think he undervalues the power of stories to bond communities together. Like, he doesn't talk about that too much, and maybe undervalues the palliative aspect of storytelling, where sometimes the people are just suffering too much to have mental space for aporia, for like a uncomfortable uncertainty on top of their present suffering of something else, and so just needing some kind of comfort. And then a very didactic philosophical story may not be the kind of thing that they need in that moment. Yeah, I think that's clear enough for my side.
Yeah, I can definitely agree with you on the palliative aspect. On the other hand, I think Plato actually does value very highly the power of stories to shape society and to shape an audience, and that's exactly why he wants to censor and limit it. Is he doesn't want the people to go off on their own whims, and he wants to again, political philosophy there. He wants to shape the hoi polloi into what the best shape for the state. And and I find it sort of amusingly self-referential about the complaining about the lack of value of stories in the middle of a story. Kind of amusing. Tag.
I would also like to share with you guys a bit of what I drew from Michael Sugru's overarching commentary on the entire Platonic corpus that I found interesting. If you guys think it's a good idea to proceed.
Sure.
Okay, so Peter Adamson also mentioned that, well, in a sense, it's like Plato telling Homer and Hesiod, "This, my friends, is how you do it." And so to also address this idea of him criticizing them, well, he criticized them but tried to one-up them. He tried to make Socrates into a hero that is both superior to Achilles and Odysseus, and also superior to Hercules, which arguably these three heroes were the Homeric and Hesiodic pretty popular figures and probably role models. And Socrates, Plato's Socrates, is a non-violent guy. He never shows any aggression or any aggressive tendencies in any of the stories in which he appears. He spreads these values that Plato considers higher above than what his competition and predecessors did. And so, yeah, so this is kind of like an attempt to encapsulate one aspect of what Plato was trying with his character Socrates. Also, according to Michael Sugru, Plato seemed to be aiming at syncretizing the cultures of the river valley civilizations that lasted a really long time indeed, the ones that he had any chance to be knowledgeable about, like Egypt, Mesopotamia, and perhaps even India. These river valley civilizations lasted a long time and were characteristic by their stability, especially Egypt, that was lasted perhaps 12 millennia or something like that. And one of the things that Plato probably noticed when he traveled was the contrast between the stability of peoples like Egypt, like cultures like Egypt, and his own Athenian culture that was quite erratic and flawlessly aiming at things that were dictated by their the elite's ambitions and passions, very short-term kind of decisions. in contrast to the more ritualized and very prudent modes of acting from either the Egyptians or even the Spartans that were quite they pondered things for quite a while before doing something. So he wanted to supersede the Greek poets with his own artistry in myth building, mainly by mythologizing Socrates and his noble sophistry. But like Plato being the new Homer, Socrates being the new improved Achilles and Odysseus, like I mentioned. Plato also showed a greater mastery in the knowledge of human nature to supersede the tragedians and comics, Aristophanes and Agathon. Comedy organized from a moral perspective that instead of making fun of superficial nonsense or toilet humor or whatnot, ridicules things that are truly worthy of ridicule, like ignorance, stupidity, viciousness, and superstition. And finally, Plato was trying to construct a teleological account of the cosmos to nullify the apparently amoral cosmologies of the Ionian physicists. So he was addressing a ton of different things at the same time in his corpus, in his works. And this is basically what I extracted from Michael Segru. Guys, feel free to comment.
Yeah, I think that's a very nice summary of Plato's work. I think a Graham's summary of Plato is basically a proto everything is similar to the way Peterson summarizes Plato, like a genius that gets or very close to all of Western philosophy really going, getting it going. But you call him the proto set theorist and the proto this and the proto that, and doing all kinds of interesting things. So yeah, so the political agenda of trying to find from more stable civilizations elements that can help stabilize the Athenian society makes a lot of sense to me. And yeah, I'm sort of innovating a bunch of philosophical lines of inquiry is also a good way to summarize it. And I guess sort of apologizing for a teacher he was very fond of that was, in his mind, unjustly put to death. Also probably one of his big motivations. Yeah. Graham?
Yeah, no, I was going to say part of the aspect of what he was doing with Socrates is creating that new mythological hero for the written word, because Achilles and Achilles, Odysseus, and Hercules, those were all part of when it was all oral tradition, repeated poetic epics. Now that they had writing, Plato created Socrates as that thinking everyman, Übermensch, for the new Greek age. And you can see with the Republic, he was very concerned about how you establish stability and successful society. And he was very heavy-handed on the elites doing what they need to do, and it's okay as long as if you keep it from the masses, as long as you're doing the best for everybody. And gonna tag on that.
Yeah, I have nothing to add to you guys except to show a last final slide to close our Plato series. So if I had to put one question that encapsulates most of what Plato was trying to achieve, is this question that Peter Adamson phrased: will we adopt the virtuous life recommended by Socrates or the vicious one praised by Callicles? And also I show you the best hand produced by AI ever. It's so beautiful.
It looks like a human hand.
Yeah.
So wonderful. Also, Socrates is looking jacked in that.
Yes. But I think they were supposed to be jacked because they both indulged in philosophy and went to the gymnasium.
And wrestling, philosophy and wrestling.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah, that seems like a really good place to call it a day. Unless you want to say anything else, Graham?
No, it was a lot of fun wrestling with Plato.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, thank you to you both. I appreciate it a lot. I learned a lot from this. I'm enjoying it quite a lot. And thank you to the listeners for joining in. And we'll see you again next week, starting with some Aristotle. All right. Bye-bye.